Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on the unceded lands of the Gayamargo people by me, Liam Miller, he, him, he's a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. My guest today is Aaron Griffith. Aaron, welcome along.
Thanks for having me. So good to be here.
So for those who don't know Aaron is assistant professor of history at Whitworth University over in the US, where he teaches American history and history of Christianity. He's a former postdoctoral fellow at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics and an instructor at Washington University's Prison Education Program. He has written for the Washington Post and Religion News Service, and the book we are discussing today is his new book of 2020, God's Law and Order, The Politics and Punishment in Evangelical America, which is out with Harvard University Press, and you can pick up wherever you get books, and hopefully this interview will make you want to do just that. So, Aaron, the book, like you kind of talked about early on, is about what you say is the quintessentially American gospel and the law amalgamation, the work of soul-saving witness and spiritual concern within the context of severe punishment, all of which characterized evangelical influence in prison and criminal justice in the 20th century. So it's this book of a religious history of mass incarceration, and also in its own way, a history of modern evangelicalism explored through this lens of concern about crime and punishment. So I guess, where did this idea to explore this come from? What got you kind of, you kind of talk a bit in the book about, your personal interest in thinking these questions through. So how did it kind of develop? And was it one of those ones that you were like immediately like, yeah, this is definitely enough for quite a full comprehensive treatment of a book? Or was it just kind of like, oh, I'm in a rabbit hole and this is going much deeper than I thought?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had a lot of rabbit hole moments while writing this book. I'm sure a lot of historians, have those moments where you're in the archives or digging through somebody's papers and you see something and you're like, it turns into something else. I had a lot of those. We can talk some about those because they definitely changed the direction of the book. But as far as what got me interested in the topic more generally and how I saw the book coming together early on, I was in a doctoral program at Duke Divinity School, where I was studying American religious history. And I needed to find a topic to write my dissertation on. So a dissertation is like this big paper thing that you write at the end of your studies. And I knew that I was interested in the history of evangelicalism. And I had been reading like all of these wonderful books through my coursework and my comprehensive exams by people like Darren Dochuk and Molly Worthen and my advisor, Kate Buller. And I saw how there were so many different narrations of modern American evangelicalism and politics and culture going off in tons of different directions, showing evangelical influence on any number of issues and the ways evangelicals have been influenced. And I started to think about what other issues perhaps are worth considering. A lot of evangelicals get talked about with reference to abortion, capitalism, free market economics, things like that. And I was trying to think about, okay, what other ways of understanding evangelicals are there? From the other end of things, though, I was taking courses actually during my master's and then my master's program on prisons and prison ministry. And I studied with a theologian or a biblical scholar at Duke Divinity School named Douglas Campbell, who's a scholar of Paul's letters in the New Testament. And Douglas is very interested in prisons and prison ministry. And I was working with him some and taking courses, and through his influence was reading books on the history of the American prison system. Books, some of which are very sort of familiar to a wide audience, like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. And I started through both of these moments seeing a possible opening of, I wonder what evangelicals were thinking about prisons? What were they thinking about criminal justice, especially given that over the course of the 20th century, evangelicals in the United States are growing in their cultural and political influence, and prisons were expanding and growing from this, especially in the second half of the 20th century. And so the puzzle I wanted to then solve is like, what do those two realities have to do with one another? What happens if we tell the story of modern American evangelicalism with an eye towards issues of crime and punishment? And on the other hand, what happens if we tell this, as you said, and it's the line I use in the book, a religious history of mass incarceration? There's so many ways, so many important ways of narrating and understanding the massive prison system that is present in the United States, and the ways that it has its, it is so rooted in our politics and culture and the logic even of how we do things. There's economic explanations, there's political explanations, there's cultural, there's racial explanations of how this all comes together. And I was like, what does religion have to do with this? Not because we need to forget all that other stuff, but how does religion intersect with all those other realities? So that's the sort of big academic puzzle that I was wanting to sort of mess with early on in my doctoral work, and that turned into my dissertation and then turned into the book later on. The personal side of it, though, and I'm open about this in the book, and I've talked about this elsewhere, is that I was in my master's program, beginning then, I started volunteering in a prison. I was doing prison ministry work with first with a local church, and then eventually with a prison ministry close to Durham, North Carolina. And I was volunteering with this ministry. It's a ministry I still stay in touch with today. They're doing amazing work. Alamance Orange Prison Ministry is the name. And I was going into prison and seeing, first of all, just prison. Seeing like what is going on in these facilities that are often hidden from the public eye. I was meeting the men who are incarcerated there and hearing their stories, hearing the very just remarkable stories and just ways that they understood and saw the world, and doing that in the context of church, of a religious gathering, not always with Christians. There were many different religious traditions represented in these gatherings, but I started to think about how this academic puzzle also had personal resonances, not only for me, but for the fellow ministers and Christians who are doing this work in prisons. And I saw this book in some ways as just a way to, hopefully, my hope is to give a resource for people who do prison ministry, people who are interested in thinking through what their church's relationship to the criminal justice system is and should be. And that's the personal side of this as well.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. So I guess I'm curious, because you mentioned some of those rabbit holes and some of the surprising ways. What was there anything that, but because I think that's often, I guess, the way when you start a project, you often have to have some broad idea. That, one second, I just realized my mic wasn't plugged in. It'll be recording, but this will improve the sound quality.
Awesome.
Very 90-something episodes in, just a true professional at this stage. And to prove that, I'm going to leave all this in. So just keep me humble. I think, with you start a project and you go, okay, yeah, start to have some broad ideas. Or, yeah, I think this is how it might connect. This could be my broad argument and a broad thesis. And then you start to read. And sometimes a bunch of that gets like kind of confirmed and fleshed out. And sometimes it goes, oh, wow, did not see this whole piece coming. Was there anything particularly, I'm sure there were lots, but is there anything that kind of strikes you as particularly surprising that you kind of encountered along your way, something you just really didn't expect and that jumped out?
Yeah. A lot of examples, and this for me is like the most exciting part of research. It's a very nerdy thing to say, but it's true. Like I just love, like, you think you make a guess you think you're going to go a direction, and then sometimes that's confirmed and it's great, and the evidence you find it all works out. But often you find stuff that just puts you in a different place. And for me, I think two big examples of that were, as I was getting started with the project in the dissertation stage, I was reading great books that really helped me orient myself to this by people like Winifred Sullivan, whose book Prison Religion is sort of like a legal study and ethnography of modern, almost contemporary American evangelical influence in a prison in Iowa. Books by theologians like Mark Lewis Taylor, who were writing about in a very theological way about prisons. And I was getting oriented with those texts. Tanya Ayersen's work on prison fellowship and other evangelical prison ministries. And I thought, okay, as a historian, here's these theologians and anthropologists who are writing about this stuff. My goal and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of trace the earlier history, and I'll start in the 1970s. And the 1970s were important for me because that's when the largest prison ministry in the United States, Prison Fellowship, which is led by Chuck Colson, I'm a former Nixon administration figure. Prison Fellowship begins in 1976. And that for me was like, all right, this is going to be very much a late 1970s, 1980s, up to the present story. And the more I got into, and I thought I was just going to focus on prison ministries for the most part. Like that for me seemed like a big enough story. It's something to work on. And the more I got into it, the more I started reading evangelical periodicals, the more I started talking to people who were involved in prison ministries, especially have been involved in the 1970s and 80s, the more I realized this story begins earlier. It doesn't start in the 70s. It doesn't start with Colson in Prison Fellowship. There's all these other ministries, first of all, that are going on before this, that Colson inherits their mantle in some ways, I think. But it actually, you can't talk about prisons and prison ministries until you talk about the policies and the cultural changes that help make these institutions, that help, that quite literally put people inside these, behind bars inside these places. And so the project started unfolding of not only talking about prison ministry, but talking about evangelical support for policing, evangelical support and influence in political changes that are happening in the 1960s that expand the criminal justice system. And that earlier sort of law and order shift, and it's not just limited to the 60s, but I sort of even began earlier in the book. I saw that we had to tell this story together of not only the prison ministry story, but also the ways evangelicals are thinking about crime and punishment in other ways. The other part of this, and this is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of the book, and it's something I still wrestle with some, is as I was going this route of thinking about evangelical influence in law and order politics, what I expected to find as I was reading various evangelicals who were writing or speaking on criminal justice issues was a very punitive approach. I expected them to be like tough on crime, lock them up, throw away the key, just very punitive through and through. And what I found, I did see that a fair amount, and I write about that in the book. But a lot of what I saw was, and this is a big part of the story I tell in the book, is a conception of the criminal justice system by evangelicals as a humanitarian, conversionist, transformative place and institution. That policing and prisons and rehabilitation is good for people. It's not just about punishing, it's good for them. And this was a humanitarian sentiment, I sort of figured out, that was very much in line with the origins of the penitentiary itself in the early 19th century. The penitentiary, the rise of the penitentiary in the United States was really led by humanitarians who wanted to create an institution that was going to help people, that was going to move the United States away from this, what they saw as a barbaric, punitive form of justice with beatings and putting people on the stocks. And they wanted to create a penitentiary where people could be transformed and changed. And I think this is also the story of how a lot of evangelicals and Americans more generally in the 20th century understood criminal justice. Now, it obviously wasn't that, but that was the hope for it, which I think actually is key for understanding why the criminal justice system is so deeply seated in Christians' imagination and their hopes for what crime and punishment, or for what punishment can be. And I think it explains a lot of why we are in such an intractable place in our own, in my own context in the United States with regards to prisons. We cannot imagine something different because there are so many humanitarian hopes baked into this system.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yes, thank you. And I guess like that's somewhat ties into one of your, a key argument in the book, because like, how did this come about? In some simple ways, you say, well, because it mattered to evangelicals, like the idea of crime and punishment and the transformation of people mattered, because not everything does, right? And you can't carry it. So I think that was a really interesting kind of observation, that it was just something that mattered. And I guess one thing I was thinking about is that you kind of talk about in that early part of the book, as you're reaching earlier, there were these kind of quite mainstream attitudes that there was an increasing lawlessness, like kind of the interwar period. There's increasing lawlessness, increasing chaos, and it needs to be controlled and dealt with. And one of the reasons they think that there's this lawlessness, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, is it's linked to increasing secularity. So things are becoming more secular and they're becoming more lawless. Thus, and even you kind of say it's not necessarily this like very direct, then thus we need to bring people back to God, but that it informs the attitudes, it informs bringing it in that crime at least needs to be dealt with, and one way is this. So I guess I'm curious about that link of the lawlessness, secularity, and how that leads to crime needs to be dealt with, and evangelicals then going, and we can be part of that in some way.
So the book, the very first chapter of the book is actually not about evangelicals in the sense that I think most people think about them, people like Billy Graham, sort of post World War II up to the present. It's about this interwar period, or really the late 19th century up to the Second World War, this sort of broad terrain of the chapter. And there I really try to show how Christians and really religious people of all stripes, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews, are increasingly becoming concerned with this downward spiral of America into lawlessness. And that works itself out in so many different ways and in so many different arenas. There's prohibition is a big part of this. Concerns about lynching and race are baked into this. But the overarching story is that liberals and conservatives in these various traditions, they disagree on all kinds of ways to understand crime. They have so many different views as to what we should do, but crime, lawlessness, disorder are all a shared concern here. And the trial that I talk about is this trial in the mid-1920s that I think crystallizes a lot of this, which is the trial of Leopold and Moab, which is this duo, these two young men in Chicago who are on trial for murder. And this trial to me, was just there were so many echoes of sort of these other trials of the century that are happening around the same time, like the Scopes trial, where everyone is not only invested in like, what's the verdict of, did these guys do it or whatever, but what does this crime signify for understanding our current cultural moment? And in this trial, Clarence Darrow is involved, and he's also involved in the Scopes trial, which is interesting. And people are really trying to link Leopold and Loeb's murder to the fact that they are products of the University of Chicago, which is seen as this sort of modernist bastion, and that they had been reading Friedrich Nietzsche, and so we're involved in all these sort of controversial intellectual projects. And I think that for me, this was emblematic of how lawlessness and secularity were linked in the public imagination. And this was a linkage that liberals and conservatives were very comfortable making, even as they diagnosed it beyond that differently. And that sets up the post-war era quite well for evangelicals like Billy Graham, who are wanting to make their mark, who are wanting to capture hearts and minds and sell out stadiums for their evangelistic events and get on the radio and get on television. Lawlessness is a very, it's something I think they were genuinely concerned about, but something they could frame as part of America's sinful, the sin problem facing America, which is why very quickly into the 50s and 60s, evangelists like Billy Graham start talking about delinquency and gangs and gangsters. Billy Graham makes a movie about a gangster coming to Christ that I write about in the book. It's a fun watch. I don't know if you can actually watch it on YouTube, but it's about this gangster named Jim Voss, who works with the mob as a wiretapper, and he comes to Christ as a Billy Graham crusade. I mean, it's a real story of this guy, but Billy Graham and his ministry team know that there's something there, there's something resonating in the popular imagination.
Yeah, I think that's also really key. So you talk about that the evangelicals here are not like, because we often think evangelicals are framed as like cultural reactionaries often with a lot of in the political discourse, because this was actually a mainstream concern. There was mainstream support for we need to get this under wraps and we need to expand, law and order and crime punishment needs to be, that's America, that's just mainstream support, and it's tapping into that, and then maybe they're utilizing it for a particular movement toward conversion and framing it as sinfulness. But it's not like they were introducing whole cloth this idea of crime's a problem and needs to be dealt with.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think this has bearing even on just our contemporary moment. This is something I think about a lot, is not just with evangelicals, but even with people like Donald Trump and sort of the movements that he represents. I think that there is a temptation to understand American evangelicals and Donald Trump and Christian nationalists or whatever route we'd want to go as somehow foreign or different than the noble ideals of the American mainstream, as somehow aberrant. And my argument's that no, this is not a backlash. This is not a somehow a different thing. This is actually, they're drinking from the same trough, as it were, as sort of the animating center, I think, of American life. And this is why, to use the example of crime and punishment, Donald Trump and Joe Biden are posited, I think, by many Americans as these very different options politically for the United States. But on issues of like policing and prisons, historically, they're not that different. Trump called himself the law and order candidate in the last election, but there were few politicians more law and order in the 1980s and 1990s than Joe Biden as a senator.
Yeah.
And I think that dynamic of seeing evangelicals and the political movements that resonate with evangelicals as not as backlashes, but as part of a consensus is really important for my book's argument, but I think it also just helps us make sense of where we are today.
And I think what's interesting also is you talk about, so it comes from the mainstream, but also by having that kind of evangelical support, there's a way of making these things neutral, right? Like that this actually isn't really a political stance to support this kind of push for law and order, this push for incarceration, and that this is the way that you transform a person and thus a society. Like it creates a kind of neutrality around it by being wedded to evangelicalism, because evangelicalism itself kind of creates, purports this kind of neutrality within as American kind of thing, which I think is important.
Totally. I think neutrality is a great word. And I would give a shout out here to people like political scientist Naomi Murakawa, who I really learned from here. Her book, The First Civil Right, is very helpful for showing, and I draw on her work in my book, how aspirations of neutrality, especially along lines of racial neutrality, were so crucial in the development of the modern American criminal justice system, where there were hopes that policing and courts and prisons could be reformed and could serve as ways to secure people's rights, and that we could move away from, again, like you hear this is the same stuff that people were saying in the early 19th century. We can move away from the relics of the barbarous past and move towards a very neutral, streamlined system that can help people. And I think that that was powerful, not only for evangelicals, powerful for many Americans, but in the book, I really try to show that for evangelicals, this is why so much of what they are doing connects with other people that aren't evangelicals. A lot of the issues that evangelicals are getting involved in sort of the post World War II era, they're butting heads with other sectors of the populace. So, for example, evangelicals and Catholics are butting heads on issues like, the campaign of Kennedy. Evangelicals and liberal Protestants are butting heads on any number of things. And I try to show how all of these groups in some ways they are more often than not, especially on the lay level, I think, understanding crime as a problem to be solved. And evangelicals really find an opportunity to lead the way on this. And that is because it's seen as neutral. It's seen as just a normal American issue of concern.
I'm curious if that neutrality helps, because I was thinking, so we kind of talk about how post-war, the evangelicals kind of find this line between the liberal and fundamental line and pushed into, we got to do a crime, but it's still more on maybe a kind of personal conversional. I want to come back to conversion more broadly in a bit. Then the 60s and 70s, there's kind of a shift to, actually, we're now going to be explicitly supporting politics, politicians, and movements about crime and punishment, about the expansion of the criminal justice system and its increasing militarization. It's an actual explicit, we're going to support that. And so I'm curious a bit about that move in general, and particularly how that move isn't seen as betraying the broader emphasis on small government, right? And the broader emphasis on government needs to be out of our lives. It's like that for everything. But here, absolutely, we can put millions and millions of dollars and breach all, and all kind of civil liberties can be thrown out the window because this, and is that because of neutrality, or is that just because it's almost like the ends are so important in that particular case, or is it just seen as a totally different, that's like in maybe in the same way military is, that's not really government, it's another kind of thing entirely?
Yeah, I think this was the question over the size and scope of the state is really interesting to me,
Mm.
because as in the 60s and 70s and 80s, there are increasing numbers of conservative politicians, and evangelicals are lining up behind a lot of them, who are arguing using big government and big government programs, especially like the Great Society and sort of social welfare programs, as these foils of things we got to get rid of. And this is what, like, I think really brings Reagan into power as both a governor in California, and then as the president, is making this very effective argument that government is the problem, that the size of the state is not only wasteful and wasting taxpayer dollars, but it's destroying personal initiative and everything. Even as Reagan, as a governor and as a president, is growing the size of the prison system and expanding policing. So I think what helps make sense of this, in part, is this focus on individual accountability that people that leaders like Reagan, but also evangelicals, are very invested in. To say, well, you did the crime, you're going to serve the time. Our prison system, our justice system, is simply reacting to individuals who have, as individual agents, who are making bad choices, who are dangers to their communities. And I think that individualistic calculus still works within that framework, even as the state is exploding in size and scope, and in terms of the money that's being spent on it. But this is why my final chapter of the book is on Chuck Colson, not so much as prison minister, but as criminal justice reformer. And this is the argument he makes. He says, I'm a conservative. I am someone who believes in small government. And it is crazy for conservatives to line up behind these giant government programs called prisons. Like, that's what they are. And he's like, we are betraying what truly makes the conservative tradition in America great, because we are, we are investing in these bureaucracies, these criminal justice bureaucracies that are nothing. He sees them as fully in line with the sort of the welfare state. And I think that gets him into some trouble, but I think this is a very effective argument he makes for many evangelicals that I think has resonance today, even for better or worse, where reformers on the left and the right who know that something's amiss in the justice system say that we need to make this more efficient. We need to cut expenses. We need to maximize the taxpayer dollar and what it's going for here. And I think then the problem, of course, is that potentially that reduces everything to this just very cost benefit kind of equation. But I think it's at least philosophically consistent with what someone like Colson was arguing for.
So we've had kind of this idea of neutrality being important, and then you've introduced here the importance of individualism. And there's two ways I want to go with that in a second. Well, I want to go two ways. First, I want to go here, which is, so the evangelical movement that you're talking about, you're focusing predominantly on white evangelicals. The prison system is predominantly black and brown. It's in terms of inmates, and that obviously grows increasingly across the back end of the 20th century. And yet, and much has been spoken about the kind of evangelicals talking about being, a colorblind approach, which fits with both the neutrality stuff you've been talking about, the individualism, but obviously has been shown by many works elides all kinds of social and structural evils that contribute to this. So I'm curious about the balance, how that changes over the time. How, and because in some way, I think you pointed out earlier, it's like the colorblind frame adds to the issue, right? That it doesn't, and obviously people made this point, doesn't help. So yeah, so I'm just curious a bit about that, the way, you know, race plays into the particularly religious history, because as you said, people have approached this whole conversation from race, how that informs this kind of piece.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that happen that create these conditions for evangelicals. I think one is that they simply after the civil rights movement, many evangelicals, like Billy Graham, abandon the segregationist sentiment that previously, I think, characterized a lot of white evangelicals, especially in the South. And Graham becomes much more willing to, and he's doing this before, you know, the 1960s, but he is way more interested in issues like racial reconciliation, and putting Black evangelists on his staff, and speaking about America's racial problems. And he's not the only one. Like, I think a lot of white evangelical leaders come to recognize that, like, there are problems here, and not only problems historically, but in the present. And the racial reconciliation movement is very big for a lot of evangelicals, especially in like the 80s. I actually, you know, I think there's a great piece in Christianity Today that was written by Daniel Silliman that came out today, I believe, on Promise Keepers, this evangelical men's movement, which the name and the goal of the ministry was about like sexual purity and like men being faithful to their wives. But a lot of what they did and talked about was racial reconciliation. Black and white Christians learning to, you know, white Christians repenting for the sins of the past and moving forward in a way where they could work together. And I think a lot of white evangelicals from the 60s on are trying to figure out what it means to worship and do advocacy in a nation where, you could put it cynically, where you can't make the same segregationist sort of claims anymore. You cannot be overtly racist anymore. That's a negative way to put it. And I think that there are some people who were that cold and calculating. But I think on the positive side, there were a lot of white evangelicals who were just like, wow, something's wrong. We've got to fix this. Like, our churches are all white. There's all these issues that are defined by, you know, by race that are showing our blind spots. We got to do something about this. The problem, though, is that I think through the colorblind frame that was posited to say that we need to just not talk about race, we need to just see each other as individuals, we need to just simply love one another and reconcile as individuals. It doesn't matter what your color is. That not only moved white evangelicals away from structural considerations of the ways that race intertwined with any number of issues relating to the economy and lack of access to education and political power. I think it also, and this is the argument I make in the book, set evangelicals up to support expanded policing of predominantly African-American and non-white communities. Because for evangelicals, they saw the police and expanded criminal justice, the expanded criminal justice system, as these are not structural racial concerns. These are simply places where people are breaking the law. So what do you do with people who are breaking the law? You lock them up. And that's what's good for these neighborhoods. Evangelicals, I think actually some of them saw policing as a good thing for non-white communities, as very much part of that humanitarian impulse. And this really came home for me through a guy named John Anderson, who I write about. He's a congressman from Illinois. And Anderson, his career as a public figure, I think, exemplifies all of this, where he early on in his career was very conservative and very much what we might call like a culture warrior, or even a fundamentalist. He, proposes like an amendment to the Constitution early on in his career to get the United States to recognize like Jesus as, something like recognize that Jesus is the sole ruler and of the land or something like that. It doesn't go anywhere, and people kind of like roll their eyes at it. But over the course of like the late 50s and 1960s, Anderson changes. And he moves away from this culture warrior mentality to a much more open, moderate, evangelical faith. And he starts to see how he had been wrong on past issues, like of his sort of Christian nationalist aspirations. And he has a change of heart on race. And he's like, we have to support the work of the civil rights movement. We have to do away with these racially discriminatory laws that have been in place for so long. And he becomes a really key conservative Republican voice in supporting the 1968 federal housing bill, which is sort of one of these last pieces of civil rights legislation that go through. And he says, part of my shift here was because I was like learning more about my faith from places like Christianity Today, these like evangelical publications. He sees this as very much a Christian part of his testimony. But at the same time he's doing all this, he's becoming more supportive of law and order, of saying that crime is a problem, that we need to expand the policing and the criminal justice system to deal with these issues, to secure a more racially just society, even. And I think that this, for me, this is all in the middle of the book. Like, this just sums up so much of how I think why the not only our prison system has grown and the way it has, and why it has caught up so many disproportionately poor and people of color within it, but why it hasn't been seen as a bad thing for so long. And why even today there are politicians who are saying we don't incarcerate enough people.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for that. That's really helpful. I mean, the book is so rich. There's so much we haven't even been, got near covering. And even one of the main, points of the book is about how important conversion, evangelicals' point of conversion plays in so much of this, and the actual, ministries in prison and seeing, people being transformed there, how much that is an emphasis. But because we're running short of time, I'm just curious to kind of talk a little about where you end, which, kind of goes a bit back to where, part of your impetus for writing was your own experience there. And one of the things you talk about is the fact that evangelicals do show up in prisons. And I've heard kind of this, talked about before, where people might say liberals, have a, maybe a better idea, better politics about prisons and criminal justice, but they never actually go to them. And evangelicals have a worse idea, but are actually there. And so in some ways your book is kind of this, within it, as you say, is this encouragement to those who are showing up or who will be there in the future to think about the way that, as you say, coming from a lot of this stuff, you say, is tied to caring about people, humanitarian ideas, but because they're not thinking it, it's not being looked at with this broader lens, end up supporting things that actually are counteracting, what they're purporting to hope to do. So I guess there's this sense of just that. I mean, I love the very last line of the book, but about conversion and playing on that again. But there's this, this idea that those who are there, this book is this resource to think again about how to be there, or what to do in those you're there, and what you do about when you're not there, about, transforming what's going on?
Yeah, I really think that what people often ask me, like, okay, so what should I do?
Mm-hmm.
Like whether or not they've read my book, this will often come up, like if we're talking about criminal justice issues or prison problems or whatever, like what's the thing to do practically? And I think like just going to a prison
Mm-hmm.
is the first thing to do. Getting to know people who are incarcerated, or maybe thinking about who you already know that's been affected by the justice system, because chances are you know somebody, whether or not they've been incarcerated. But I think that there's a move in a lot of sort of more critical circles that are critical of evangelicals to say like, oh, well, they are so focused on like the individual and the personal, they have to like get a bigger systemic or political consciousness. And I actually think that the personal starting there is great. Go into a prison and get to know the people inside of the prison and learn from them, become their friends, hear their stories, and allow yourself to be transformed. And I'll be a little theological here, like allow yourself to see what God might be doing in those places already and how you can be a part of that. And I think that is a very powerful place to begin and to be sustained by as we do the work that addresses systems, that addresses our like punitive politics, that addresses the size and scope of our system. I think that like this was so brought home to me because I interviewed like tons of prison ministry leaders for this book. I like was spending tons of time like in archives, prison ministry archives, collections, and I just came away time and time again just so moved by the commitment and work that people, evangelicals, what they were doing in prisons. Like whatever your theological commitments or whatever, like I think I was very struck by how not only genuine, but compassionate and caring evangelicals were. And sometimes that got them into trouble because it blinded them to things. But I also think there were so many moments I saw of like an incarcerated person writing to an evangelical ministry and saying like, y'all came to my prison last week and you led a worship service, and I like can't stop thinking about how like wonderful that made me feel because you showed up. And I think that there's something there. I really think that there's something real about that. That's an important place to begin for evangelicals. Like we need that. We need that not only as evangelicals, but I think as Americans, like to realize a personal connection to these places, to not push them out of our field of vision, to not marginalize them any more than they already are. And I think that's a good place to start.
Thank you for that, Aaron. The book, folks, I hope you'll all be very inspired to check it out. It is great. It's like it's as I said before, it's so rich, it's really readable and fascinating and well researched, and it goes in so many places you wouldn't expect. Like as it's a cultural history, so you find yourself in all different and fascinating places along the story. So please check out God's Law and Order: The Politics and Punishment in Evangelical America, out with Harvard University Press. So please check that out. And Aaron, thank you for coming on the podcast. Is there anything else that you'd like to promote, plug, draw people's attention to?
No, not really. I'm so grateful for this conversation. I would just encourage your listeners that if you are interested, like check out the book, but and let me know if you do read it. Like you can find me on Twitter or go to my website and let me know what you think about it. But also there's so much work being done by other scholars and thinkers and activists on these issues too. And I've got one behind me right here, America on Fire, by Elizabeth Henton, which is on policing and urban rebellions. I mentioned the work of Naomi Murakawa, Michelle Alexander. Read all of it. Like, if you haven't, this is great stuff. And please, though, if you do read my book, let me know what you think about it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. And thanks everyone for listening. I'll see you all next week. Bye.